Good evening, Bill.
Good evening, Sandy. How are you?
I'm really good on this beautiful solstice.
Yeah, is today the actual solstice? I didn't notice this year.
Well, yeah, the sun rose at its earliest.
Okay.
It's all
Which
day
is what,
here.
2:23 a.m. for you?
Not here, not in the south of England. No.
What is it, like 4:30 or something?
Yeah,
That's so insane.
yeah. I mean, it's earlier still up where my dad is.
Yeah,
And of course,
sure.
earlier still, I've got a friend in Iceland, and he's been living with midnight sun for what seems like a long time.
I don't think I could do the other side of that.
No, I don't either. I've often thought that.
Yeah. I
Wherever I've
think
been
where
tempted.
I get a lot of seasonal stuff myself, so I'm
Mm.
trying to. Anyway, that's exciting. It's the solstice.
Mm. Anyway, today we're talking about consequences. Um, let's
And I
talk
said
about,
consequences of or for whom, and you didn't.
well, I mean, there's consequences, the game, right? The
Okay.
Victorian parlor game, where one person writes something on a piece of paper, then it gets folded over and passed to the next person who writes something else, folds over, passes to the next person, writes something else, and at the end it's unfolded in an entire story of something quite unusual usually is revealed.
Sure.
Mm. There's also consequences. There's an implication of maybe it being quite a negative thing, a consequence, like a response to an action that's not perhaps good. There's maybe a moral context to consequence.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. I was thinking about consequences really because, well, in part because actually I was in a car accident, as you know, a couple of weeks ago. And I think I realized that, within a whisker of chance, um, the consequence of my actions, though I wasn't to blame, could have been catastrophic and would have resulted in the death of a child.
Yeah.
And luckily, that young person was relatively unharmed. Mm, but it struck me that I could have had an otherwise totally ordinary day and made an ordinary action, which is simply driving my car sensibly within the speed limit, paying attention, no distractions, with my glasses on, blah, blah, blah. Mm, Yet still, my action could have resulted in this horror. And instead of speaking to a mother who was very angry with her daughter when she arrived to come and pick her up, I could have been meeting a fellow mother face to face in a courtroom, or unthinkably, in a hospital or a morgue. It's really been quite powerful. The impact of consequence. I came home and I said to my doctor, I said, I've been in this accident and I'm very upset. And I said, do you realize, as I've said to you, that with the slightest change of fate or whatever one believes in, some other mother somewhere could have her entire life ruined. And then I said to Imogen, and also, my life would be essentially ruined, and to an extent, your life would be hugely impacted if
Mm-hmm.
the outcome had been different. Thank goodness it wasn't. And not to dwell on it necessarily, but just again, it has really focused me on this idea of consequences.
But at the same time, there's nothing you could have changed that could have changed that. It wasn't your fault.
No, and I think that's the only reason why I've been able to sleep at night, actually.
Yeah, right.
But the
If you
point,
had been looking at your radio when it happened or something like that, that would have been even more self, you know, defeating.
well, I mean, I want to think, do our actions always kind of impact what happens next?
Mhm.
Is it a very simple linear movement? We do something, this thing happens. Then we do
Well, I think
something else.
it's a very linear movement, but there are so many segments to that chain, so many links in that chain, that by the end of it, you've gone a long way, just like your Victorian game you're talking about.
Yeah, but also, how far along do we go in that line of movement before we no longer have any responsibility for our action?
True.
Well, that's what I want to look
Okay.
at least a little. How distant must we be from an action that we've made for the impact to no longer be our responsibility?
Is me buying this plastic bottle today because I was desperately thirsty going to destroy the ocean and therefore destroy the world? Is it my fault?
Mm. And we could look at this backwards and forwards, couldn't we? We could say,
Sure.
lots of conversations around culpability for past wrongdoings, for example.
Sure.
How responsible are people now for things that have happened in the distant past that those alive now have had no control over?
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, it is a parlor game, a Victorian parlor game. And in the 50s, there was also a kind of, particularly in the States, the book Ad Libs.
Mad Libs. Yes.
Mad Libs, sorry, not Ad Libs, Mad Libs,
Yeah.
obviously. And
Sure.
anyway, I was looking at this kind of thing where, there's an exclamation and an adverb and
Yep.
a noun and then an adjective or whatever, in whatever order it's going to come. And people just insert words out, he said stupidly as he jumped into his convertible car and drove off with his brave wife. Lots of those words could be changed, supplanted, and we could have very different seeming outcomes.
Yep.
And depending on who is approaching the blank that has to be filled at the time, we could have really diverse sentences, but obviously that's emblematic, of course, of how any of us approach any circumstance in which an impact is made or an action is made that results in a consequence. So anyway, in art, there is or was a surrealist movement, les Cadavre Exquis, the beautiful corpse. Do you know about
Mm-hmm.
this?
No.
So, little trick of surrealists, especially Tongoy and Robertson and Man Ray, all the usual people you would think of in that kind of collective in Europe.
Sure.
Were very taken with this parlor game of consequences, and they thought of it really as a kind of way of freeing up thought, making things quite fluid in terms of it being an unpredictable outcome, and they often
Chaotic. Yeah.
they often work collectively as well. I just thought this was an interesting example of that kind of mode. This is attributed to Frida Kahlo, and in actual fact, it was Kahlo with a group of friends, and she started it off by drawing the head, and it is meant to be Diego Rivera, her
Sure.
husband. And as a sort of Mexican counterpart to what was happening in Europe at a similar period, there's lots of evidence, really, not just within the so-called elite art world, but just anywhere around the world, really, from that Victorian period, where people found this an intriguing thing to do. And I don't know if have you ever played this game yourself?
No. I mean, I'm aware of the concept, but I don't think I've ever actually done it.
Mm.
But this is a visual, there was a thing in the early 2000s or like late 90s called Photoshop tennis.
Right.
Where you would send a file to someone and they'd send it back to you. They'd add something, you'd add something, and you get this absurdist visual thing. So, I mean, it's the same game, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. But again, even just in a kind of visual way, I'm thinking metaphorically about this, this is attributed to Frida Kahlo. she is essentially responsible for this drawing. But it was, a kind of collective endeavor. And I wonder if we are responsible or should face consequences for things that happen within a collective.
Well, you could even go back and say, well, why aren't her heroes responsible for making this? They're the ones who, I mean, in some ways, the Western idea of attribution of art is a really strange thing if you back away far enough.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. When you make a photograph, Bill, do
It's
you,
mine and it was never anyone else's.
yeah, I'm going to say, do you own that photograph? Are you
Yeah.
in charge of it? Are you responsible for it? Do you answer for it when asked?
Yes.
Mm.
Um, it's an interesting thing that because that also it is my business and it's also sort of ethically mine, Um, there are plenty of photographs that I've taken that have never been and will never be public because of, understandings between myself and the subjects or whatnot, that I certainly have responsibility for too.
I did once interview a photographer for this little channel, and I talked about responsibility, and I was immediately shut down. That particular person found it most obtuse that I was inquiring into their responsibility to their fan base,
Oh,
that they make work at all, that they make a certain type of work, that they address particular issues in their work. It makes me question really what you were saying, I suppose. Is there a separation of art from artist? When an artist releases
I mean,
something made into the world.
that is interesting in particular, though, what you're saying, because the artist, are they responsible for their fan base, but they can't control how their fan base reacts to their work. So therefore, should they even care about what their fan base is going to think about, what their audience is going to think about their work? If they can't control it anyway, why should they care at all? And why should they be responsible for it if they have no direct control over it?
I mean, we've seen lots of instances in popular culture, especially in music culture, big
Yep.
names, celebrity pop and rock stars being blamed for, the disasters of countercultural movement, or,
Mhm.
a rise in promiscuity because Madonna went on tour, or, whatever the limitations of that description is, socially, there would be some kind of shift, uh, perhaps because of a particular artist.
Yeah.
But, are they to blame? And even when their intention is to agitate, once agitated, is the audience to blame, or is
Yeah.
the artist to blame?
That is a very good question. I mean, and is it only artists or is it politicians? Is it writers? Is it,
Mm.
um, I also, uh, that's interesting. I hadn't seen this one. What is this?
This is obviously much more contemporary. It's the Chapman brothers, the UK enfant terrible, young British artists, Jake and Dinos Chapman. They were very taken with the notion of the exquisite corpse. By the way, exquisite corpse, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but the name Le Cadavre Exquis came from actually a consequences game that the young surrealist played. And it was something like the exquisite corpse will drink the new wine once again, or something was the sentence. And they were so, enamored with this notion of the exquisite corpse that they kept it as the name of this particular format. Anyway, Chapman Brothers, fast forward 80 years, working in the same way. So this is actually an etching. There
Yeah.
were 20 variations of this way of working, and they were printed in editions of 30. Some of them are hand tinted. I mean, it seems stupid to say, oh, well, they're really works of art. Yes, they really are actually quite exquisite. And they do that thing that they're supposed to do, in that Jake and Dinos Chapman batted backwards and forwards, apparently, with the etching plate. One would etch something, then it was covered, it was passed to the other, and so on, back and forth, back and forth. And it's a conversation, a dialogue, really, between, in this case, two people. And the outcomes are all kind of fantastical. They're surrealistic. They're also highly intricate, just as objects, as things. I think they're beautiful.
Do you think that some of the fact that they're etchings and the fact that they did these printing and sets of printing and whatnot, if this was just somebody passing back and forth a pencil and a piece of paper, would it be the same level of importance to you?
Well, I think it is an interesting comparison to what we just saw attributed to Frida Kahlo.
Sure.
You know, if I was going to show you, I mean, really, I should have had an example of.
But Frida Kahlo is not famous for what you just showed me. That
No,
sort of.
I could have shown many examples that are attributed to the Tongis, Robertson, Man Ray. You know, they were all working on these together, and the outcomes, truthfully, some of the outcomes, I just didn't like them. I didn't want to put them on screen. Whereas this, to me, is juicy. I want to look at it. You know, I have trouble with this one visually, but I understand it. But it's Frida Kahlo, and I wanted to make a point by including her. She's often overlooked, I think, when we're talking about the kind of canon of surrealism from a European perspective, or through that European lens. But anyway, with this, it is laden with a different kind of meaning, maybe, or additional layer of meaning, because of its complexity, its visual complexity. But also, I just want to mention the Chapman brothers, especially to you, Bill. In the States, you might not have heard this, and some people maybe in the UK don't know, watching. But the Chapman brothers, when Giant Gallery in Bournemouth first opened, were some of the first exhibitors in the inaugural exhibition. And they exhibited casts of what were meant to be suicide vests. And they were presented on plinths in the gallery. And on closer inspection, you would move close to them and you would see that, yes, they looked like suicide vests, but that they would have things like paintbrushes and pencils sort of tucked into them, and that actually they were an amalgam of art stuff. Anyway, we have a member of parliament who is an MP for Bournemouth called Tobias Elwood. He is best known more widely, actually, as a very brave person, very good person, who approached the dying policeman after one of the terror incidents in London, the policeman outside the Houses of Parliament. Tobias Elwood is the person who rushed to his aid. But I mean, that's evidence of somebody being a fantastic human.
Right.
But Tobias Elwood, when Giant opened its doors and he saw this work, made very negative, scathing, damning, disruptive comments about the Chapman brothers' work. Now, the consequence of their work on him was that he reacted very badly. His brother, sadly, had been killed, I think, in Afghanistan by a suicide bomber.
Sure.
Lots of stuff to do with, like, you know, the trauma within his own family.
Sure, PTSD and all that, yeah.
So he didn't like it. He was in a position of power within this area, and I think he did probably quite a lot of damage in one way, although one could also argue any publicity is good publicity for the gallery. Lots of people did flock to see it after he made such a fuss. But Stuart Semple and his team at Giant were steadfast. They kept showing these things until the exhibition finished. But the consequence of something that, you know, do we plan for consequences, I suppose? You know, did the team at Giant understand that there would be friction in exhibiting the Chapman brothers' work. I mean, a lot of their work is very dark. It's quite controversial. It can often be quite grotesque. Some
My
people
guess is yes.
Yes, right. But can we predict consequence
No.
particularly accurately?
In fact, it could have gone the other way for some unknown sort of chaotic reason. The world is a very complex and, multivariate place.
Yeah. But anyway, consequences. There's consequences in everything we do. But again, I question whether we actually are important at all, and what we do is utterly meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, really, is what we do important? Any of us? Anything that we do?
Literally any of us? No, probably not. The problem is that I don't think what any of us individually do is very important, but I think that collectively we're doing something important.
Right. So collectively, and within that collective, how responsible is the individual within the collective?
You can tie yourself up in knots with that one.
We were at once recipients of and contributors to the joy of witnessing the sudden appearance of creatures none of us had foreseen, but which we ourselves had nonetheless created.
Yeah.
Mm.
And you and I have talked about it a little bit before, the idea that, I used to think that art and creativity was a driving force in society, and kind of come to flip that around and say that it's more a mirror than it is a force. So it's interesting, even what the brothers made and put into a museum is more commentary to me than it is. I mean, I guess everything is commentary in some way if we sort of accept that we're all just machines that take input and create an output.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry to now I probably am just being obtuse. Is everything a consequence?
Yes.
Yet nothing we do is really that important.
No, I mean, it's all, does a single grain of sand rubbing against a rock on a beach, does it have consequence? No, but eventually billions of little grains of sand are going to do a lot of damage to ripping a big giant heavy rock apart, so it's cumulative, it's an aggregate that we have consequence. If you can't control in any way, and well, to a large extent, you can't control the reaction or the consequences of the things that we do in life, within some sort of paradigm of not trying to do evil on other people or whatnot.
Well, I was thinking about this again, just visually, physically, practically,
Sure.
thinking about the folds of a piece of paper,
Yep.
where what has come before is concealed and what will happen after is unknown. Now, within those limitations and with those conditions, when we make our mark, are we accountable?
Yeah.
And it strikes me that we're only accountable, as you've already suggested, as the collective, because at the final unfolding, when we see the whole picture, is the only point at which we understand our action.
And if civilization and society looks the way it does, how do we not imagine that it's just a larger version of that piece of paper?
I mean, this could be extrapolated, couldn't it? The quote by Simone Khan writing, this is a beautiful essay actually, collected essays in surrealist women. And she was writing in 1975, so well after the surrealists proper, so to speak, had been disbanded.
Sure.
But the fact that, a sudden appearance of creatures none of us had foreseen, this basically speaks to, the burgeoning life force of AI, or you know, the specter of war, or, you know,
Sure.
all these things, the tribute.
Or the invention of printing press. I mean, it's, you know, it's all, you know, it's the same thing over and over again.
I'm sure we've mentioned it before, but, you know, again, there's lots of parallels being drawn at the moment between the Manhattan Project and then the people developing ChatGPT, for example, which, you know, it is bizarre to think that something that is proven to have already caused mass destruction is
Hold on a second. Mass disruption. Whether or not it's destructive is a matter of opinion.
okay.
Just saying.
Well, that's one we could definitely argue about later.
Okay.
But anyway, the fact is that we don't see the future. We can't see it.
Yeah.
But we
yeah.
know we're in the movement towards it.
True. But there is a certain level of inevitability. You know, once somebody figured out how radioactivity works and how nuclear, you know, fission worked, it was never not going to happen that someone would make a bomb out of it, for example, you know? So it's a matter of dealing with those consequences after it happens, or I guess, I don't know.
Isn't it so that, you know, for example, with climate catastrophe,
Sure.
we know it's coming.
Sure.
In the same way that the Chapman brothers would have known this would be monstrous.
Yeah.
But they work on it. They make their etching. You know, the consequence of the movement, the action, is it theirs, even when they've been responsible for, like, the inception or the original action? It's a very, very
Do you think that people don't want to accept that their actions have consequences, though? There's a certain abdication that happens, right? Where people don't want to be responsible.
yes, but equally, I think when you take away consequence, people fall apart.
Yeah.
You know, people don't know what to do if there is no consequence for their action.
Sure.
And you know, we started out by trying to kind of arrive at a definition or a sense of the word consequence. And, you know, I mentioned that the implication is perhaps something that's quite, you know, negative. Consequence is something that happens when you've done something bad. But, you know, outcomes likewise could be positive. There could be something that I do that has a perceivably good outcome. But all I can see in that is that perhaps there's almost like no outcome, because good and bad can't exist in the future.
Well, then you get into morality, though.
Well, isn't this a moral issue?
Well, yeah, but I mean, people can judge things different ways.
Anyway, Bill Wadman, Exquisite Corpse. What's the consequence of speaking to me most weeks?
I keep thinking after we're done. Is that a consequence?
That's an excellent consequence. I love that.
There you go. I figured you'd like that.
See you next time.
All right, we'll see you.